So just a quick note on this episode, we touch on some really tricky issues around domestic violence and abuse. Please feel free to skip if that's something that's affected you personally.
I remember there was a house where my mum used to leave me because she had to work. So she'd send me to this auntie's house, and she was married to her husband and she had a couple of kids. He would beat the shit out of her. So I'm now an 8-year-old with these 2 little kids holding on to me, trying to get out of the way of 2 giant humans going at it. And she'd bleed. You were terrified.
This person got on a phone to me telling me that they had cancer and then literally mimicking coming out of anesthetic. I remember the point where I first went to my therapist and I was like, I can't get out of this thing because they're sick and they're dying and they've got cancer. And I remember her looking at me going, he is lying to you. He's lying to you.
I did end up being in a relationship where there was domestic violence.
Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Rigor and flow.
1.
Hi, beloved.
Hello.
We are back for season 2.
We absolutely are.
And the show is Rigor and Flow.
With myself, Aiwan.
And me, Tamanda. And this is the show where business meets love.
And culture meets critique.
Yeah, so this is the first one we've recorded since we actually put something out into the world.
Absolutely, yeah. How have you found season 1?
Oof, season 1. I have to say, I have loved working on this with you more than anything I've done in, I don't know, a really, really long time. It's been exciting, fun, just to be able to do something that we call the shots on and have these great conversations with you. So I've loved it. What about you?
I have loved everything about doing Rigor and Flow with you. I think the surprising thing that I didn't realize I would love as much is just being back in the technical space. So the ability, being able to record in terms of setting up the cameras, the audio, and then of course the editing as well. So I pretty much edited all of season 1. Yeah. And at first I was going to hand it over. And then I was like, I'm really enjoying it because actually in my life where I'm at in my career, I don't get a chance to do a lot of the technical artistic stuff. I'm normally giving that as a job to somebody else while I focus on exec producing, writing and developing. So it was really good to get back into that space. There are a lot of challenges.
Yeah, such as? What would you say?
Oh man, I remember the first few episodes of season 1, the 2 cameras, the mediums of us, which are actually iPhones if you don't know. So the wide is a proper DSLR camera. Okay. And the 2 shots of me and Tamanda are actually iPhones. Okay. And in the beginning, I just had them set wrong. We
didn't have them on airplane mode, so there was people calling and weird sounds.
And sometimes they were higher than the actual main camera, so they weren't the same eye line. It was really quite an interesting set of mistakes. It was a learning curve, I think. It really pushed me, I think, to try and record with 2 iPhones and an actual professional camera.
Yeah, well, I mean, your learning curve, thank God it wasn't me behind the camera because nothing would have even been in shot. So I feel like you did an amazing job and I'm really here for it. I found loads of things challenging, but also just rewarding, right? I didn't come into this expecting to, I'm kind of out of my depth. I didn't expect to know how to speak on camera. So all of those things you're learning as you go and your weird habits and thank you. Yeah. So did you, by the way. I'll tell you one of my favorite things so far has just been having people interact and share their stories and share their reflections and share the moments that they found relatable, amusing, funny, poignant. Because I really, really thought we were going to have 3 of you watching. And so far...
We've had listeners all over the world.
Yeah, I love it. I'm really here for it. And it's really cool. So if you've tuned in, thank you so much.
Absolutely. What have we got today?
I am really stoked to have this conversation with you. And it's a conversation that goes back to really quite early days in our relationship. We went on our first ever holiday to Lanzarote, story for another day. And on that holiday, both of us power read through this book that we're starting with today. And the book is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. And this is the story of a lesbian relationship that ends up having a really strong narrative around domestic violence. Yeah. And it was so impactful for both of us because we hadn't really seen that kind of issue tackled within queer communities in this kind of way. And this book is like a perfect blend of beautiful writing meets archive research. So yeah, what do you remember about this text?
I remember the writing style for me was very new. It wasn't a style that I was accustomed to. You know, some of the chapters are literally half a page long.
Yeah, a few sentences.
Yeah,
even.
a few sentences.
Yeah.
You know, and actually I loved it because it felt like you're going on a journey with the person through their eyes, but literally through their eyes.
Yeah.
Like, you know, sometimes, you know, a person might tell you something and the thing they tell you is only a sentence long, but that sentence says everything. And she does that.
Yeah.
And in that sentence, it holds a whole world of emotion and thought and
lived experience. Yeah.
You know, just like you would have in a conversation, you know, and it's almost like you piece things together if you were listening to someone between the lines. And in this case, in that one sentence or that one half of a page. So
100%. I think it made it really readable, but you really felt you were getting in a sort of a sense of how fragmented a mind can become or memory can become in the face of trauma.
Yes.
And even that feeling it evoked was very, very relatable.
Yes, yeah.
So in terms of this text, I think I'd really like to start with a quote from it that she talks about, because this is Machado talking about her own experience of domestic violence in a relationship. This is also her story of looking through the archive to find stories of other queer women who had experienced relationships. She starts in her prologue with this quote: "The abused woman has certainly been around as long as human beings have been capable of psychological manipulation and interpersonal violence. But as a generally understood concept, it and she did not exist until about 50 years ago. The conversation about domestic abuse within queer communities is even newer and even more shadowed. As we consider the forms that intimate violence takes today, each new concept, the male victim, the female perpetrator, queer abusers, and the queer abused, reveals itself as another ghost that has always been here, haunting the ruler's house."
Who's the ruler?
That's a good question. I thought the ruler in this case was the archive, and she's talking about the archive and the missing stories from it.
Okay.
And the lack of those stories, the figures that don't get spoken about in terms of intimate partner violence are in the house as ghosts.
Okay. See, I interpreted it as we live in a system created by, well, it depends what society you're in, but certainly in most societies, created by men with a certain set of rules. And we live in that house, that system. So those stories, those silences haunt that house. And you can't name it because of the rules that are put in place by the rulers of that house. And I see that in the fact that it's taken so long, for example, for women being abused by their husbands, for that to be even recognized as abuse, for example.
Yep.
And that's because of the rules put in place by the rulers of the house, which is the system in which we live. And so there's just silences.
Yeah.
Everyone knows she's getting battered, but nobody can say it. And nobody can do anything about it. The court of law won't do anything about it. So it just lives in the dark silences. So that was how I understood it.
I think that sounds like a much more likely interpretation. But also, I think the thing I would say from that, the line between our interpretation is the that the archive is a manifestation of a system that has been
Yes.
governed by men. And so who has been more involved in archiving? Men. Therefore, men as researchers are going to write the story of the system with all those silences.
And
right?
they're not going to see the issues that
gaps.
women go for.
Yeah.
And we see that in science, the way things are invented, not invented for women's bodies. Not
the things
you know
that
what
are
I mean?
not researched, the same ghosts are haunting everything.
Everything, literally.
We should actually ask, I always find it funny when you talk about your films and how people come to film screenings and they ask you questions. They have these deep interpretations
Yeah,
of your
and you're
films,
just like,
I wasn't being that deep. I just, the camera wasn't working that day. I shot this guy and so we got that in.
And we got it in.
Maybe Machado was just like, I don't know. I just said words that sounded good.
I doubt it with
doubt
her.
it.
She's a
sharp.
very, very deeply intelligent and intellectual human being.
Definitely, I agree. So no shade, Carmen.
Not like me with my crooked cameras.
There was one other quote as well from this book that I think, going back to this question of the archive, she talks about how she writes this book as a memoir of her own life and as a contribution to the archive because these silences exist. And she talks about that process of the memoir being an act of resurrection and reconstructing and recreating the past and the dialogues that go with it. And she says this of the book: I enter into the archive that domestic abuse between partners who share a gender identity is both possible and not uncommon, and that it can look something like this. I speak into the silence. I toss the stone of my story into a vast crevice, measure the emptiness by its small sound.
Ooh, she's so poetic.
She's a beast of a writer.
She really is.
She's a beast of a writer. And the thing that she gets to in that quote is this thing of our stories as queer people are not told.
Yes.
And they're not heard. And so we need to document them.
Yes.
So you've said that your life has been touched by domestic violence.
Yeah.
What do you feel able to share about that?
Oh God, here we go. Another episode.
And
of
is it
Rigor
a
and Flow.
queer experience or was it from life before you were out?
It's a mixture of both. Domestic violence is a tricky subject. And there's a reason why it made it into season 2 rather than season 1. Because I didn't know that I was ready to talk about domestic violence. But it is something that a lot of people unfortunately go through. And some people are going through it and don't even know necessarily that they're going through domestic violence because
100%.
of so many things that we are going to explore in this episode.
Yeah.
So the domestic violence I saw growing up was typically between a man and a woman, with the man as the aggressor on most occasions, except one where there was a female as the aggressor against the man.
Oh, that's interesting.
That is interesting. And I remember there was a house where my mum used to leave me because she had to work. So she'd send me to this auntie's house to be cared for. And she was married to her husband and she had a couple of kids. And when he drank, primarily, he would just become really violent. And I was only, I don't know, I must have been about 8 years old. He would beat the shit out of her. And you know when you're kids, because I was the oldest of the kids that were in that house, because she had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. And I think the boy was maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5, and a little girl was maybe 2. So I was the oldest one there. So obviously when he starts beating her, they come to me. So I'm now an 8-year-old with these 2 little kids holding on to me, trying to get out of the way of 2 giant humans, because you know, you're a kid and they're giant.
Yeah.
Going at it, you know. And she'd bleed. You were terrified. Her kids were terrified. I'm terrified. I'm trying to calm them down. I'm trying to get them into the side room to wait for the storm to pass. And when I went to school, I think one of the things that I watched, because there's two components to it, right? There's the domestic violence that happens in your actual life, and then there's the domestic violence that you see on screen, right? And the first time I saw domestic violence depicted on screen that matched what was going on in my personal life was when we watched Oliver Twist at school.
Oh, wow.
And there's a scene in it, it's one of the most harrowing, gruesome, terrifying scenes. And it's where Bill Sykes beats up and kills Nancy. And even today, till today, I can still see her massive blue eyes. And then just the violence of her getting beaten up and killed by this guy, right? So those are the two depictions of domestic violence that I encountered that kind of matched up. It was like, he's doing that to her, and I've had people in my family talk about themselves. I don't want to go into my family stories too much because it gets a bit brutal there. So I don't want to get into that too much, but there's a lot of domestic violence in my family as well. So I don't know where that leaves me, but certainly for me, it was predominantly the male as the aggressor.
Yeah.
And it being a really terrifying, horrible, horrific thing that stays with you your entire life.
Yeah, of course. It would. And I guess I'm curious because reading that Machado book together so early in our relationship, it kind of opened up this conversation about domestic violence between us.
Yes.
Quite early on. And I don't know how much you'd talked about it before or how it was handled in your family. Did it come up in previous relationships, and did it come up ever? Was it ever openly discussed in your family?
I would say my mum would talk about it in terms of story, like, stories that she had of it. And she'd talk about them as just painful stories, but they were stories. They were facts that had happened in her life, in her siblings' lives. And that was it. It wasn't like domestic violence is bad and it's evil and this is why it shouldn't happen. It was just more stories of domestic violence as opposed to what signs to look out for, how to deal with it if it happens. This is not a good thing. These are the boundaries you should set. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So was it the stories were almost normalizing of what was going on? This is just a thing that happens? Or was she processing her trauma with and on you?
I'd say it was a mixture of her processing and maybe a type of cautionary tale. Because, in our culture, we tell stories to communicate ideas, to communicate morals, to communicate paths you should avoid or take. We come from oral traditions, right?
Yeah. We tell stories to help the next generation survive.
Exactly.
So it's a cautionary tale of
yes.
Look out for this,
yes.
or you may go the way of this person.
Exactly. Exactly. And to be careful who you choose to marry. Men can be dangerous. That sort of thing is what I think she was trying to communicate to me by telling me those stories. And as I got older and could understand more, she would tell me more,
Right.
and break it down.
So do you feel that was very intentional on her part?
I think so. She didn't want me to go through what she'd gone through or what other women, because remember, my mum was a leader of women in the church that we were in. So she was hearing stories from battered women all the time, different types of stories. And so she didn't want me to go through that. So she's telling me those stories.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And as you say, it's in all of our cultures and traditions, isn't
Yes.
it, to do that?
Yes.
In that way. Moving out of that primary school and recognition of Oliver Twist, was domestic violence just a cycle that continued throughout the course of your life? Like, or was it something you just observed as a child?
I did end up being in a relationship where there was domestic violence. I just didn't know it as domestic violence.
Right.
Because the domestic violence I'd seen on screen in Oliver Twist and at my auntie's house and through the stories that my mum told didn't match what I was going through.
So say more, what was the discrepancy between what you saw and what you experienced?
So the first thing was, it was a man battering a woman.
Okay.
And secondly, it was being beaten up physically. You know, like
the
punches.
Stuff you saw in your childhood was that?
And in Oliver Twist.
Yeah.
It was being bashed up, punched, kicked, bitten, all of that horrible stuff, right? Whereas in this relationship, it was more emotional. And there was a physical component, because in this one relationship, and also it was with a woman. So it was a woman aggressing against me. And it wasn't just a woman aggressing against me. It was a woman who was femme presenting, so very feminine. And obviously I'm quite mask presenting. I'm tall. I've always been a tomboy, right? So everything was just flipped on its head.
Yeah.
And the physical presentation of it was my property being smashed to bits. Oof. So it's like, I didn't know that was a type of domestic violence. I remember we were watching the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard thing.
Oh gosh.
And when somebody was slamming doors and smashing stuff.
Yeah.
The guy in the documentary said that is a type of domestic violence.
Yeah.
Under the law, that is a type of domestic violence. I never knew that.
It's coercion, it's coercive control, because you're instilling fear in the person.
Right.
That, you know, if it's not, somebody has to touch you to make them have complete control over you. If you see someone smash something up, what can they do to you?
Yes, exactly.
You know?
Yeah. So that's what I was going through. It was like body shaming. It was like being put down. It was my property being smashed up, like I said. And it had a profound effect on me on a psychological level.
Yeah.
I wasn't the same person coming out of that relationship as I was going into it.
And what was the trajectory of that relationship? Like, presumably it didn't start with smashing up your stuff. And like, how did the relationship start and unfold? At what point did you start to realize something's not right here?
Well, I think weirdly, it was pretty much towards the beginning of the relationship.
Oh, really? Okay. So but is that so there were red flags. Now you look at it now and you just didn't see them, or like, tell me about some of the, if you don't mind, specifics.
I'm going to try and, I don't want to say too many specifics.
Okay.
But what I will say is that person was manipulative and controlling from the very beginning in very subtle ways. Hindsight is 2020. And you look back and you can really see that, oh, actually, when this person did this thing at this point, it was a type of manipulation, a subtle manipulation of me to get me to react a certain way or to change something in my life to make them comfortable, but then it makes me comfortable, makes me lose out on something. I'm not sure how much I can go into the stories because it would really give away the person. And I don't know that I want to do that.
That's interesting.
Is it?
Yes.
Why?
I'm not trying to get you to do something different, but and also a podcast is a very different format to in private, for example. But one of the things I always remember my therapist saying to me when I found myself in a very abusive situation was that my unwillingness to name the person or say what was happening is one of the ways that abuse functions and survives, is that they require a victim essentially to keep their secret. And that keeps the abuse intact and maintains a silence. Now, I'm not saying that applies. This is very different because we're going to put something out publicly. However, there is something about the way abusers get protected and manipulate people into protecting them. I'm not saying that's what's happening here.
No, I get that. I really do get that. And I don't know why, weirdly, that as I think about it, as you're talking, why I don't want to say things that could make it obvious to the people that we know. That it was that person.
That's fine. I don't want to make you say anything. I think it's an important point to make in general, because so often this is the thing, right? The dilemma that anybody who survives an abuse faces. It's like, I don't want to say because people we mutually know might not know, but that abuser is so often, you know, relying on the fact that there's this shared network and they know that person wants to protect them from being judged or protect themselves from being perceived a certain way.
Yeah.
And I imagine for you as someone who's mask presenting, that could very easily play into a kind of stereotype that also exists in queer communities of needing to be tough and not needing to show that vulnerability. Do you see what I mean? I think we hear those narratives when men face abuse, and I wonder how relevant they might be as well for us as queer people.
I think they are very relevant, you know, because you kind of don't want to be perceived as weak, particularly when you're, I don't know, it doesn't even make any sense because we're both women in that situation. And I'm not saying that, because then that opens a whole can of worms as well. It's like saying that women should be able to be perceived as weak and men shouldn't. And also, it's not being weak. It's called calling out the bullshit that's happening and dealing with it head on, and it hurts. You hurt internally. Your heart hurts. Your body hurts. It hurts. There's nothing weak about that at all. You know. So even as I'm saying it, I'm like, that's a twisted logic to what I'm saying. But this person was very, very manipulative from the very, very beginning. They really hated. On the surface, they supported my music and my music career because I'm a musician. I've always made music, whether it's for film, for podcasts, or just as a musician myself. And this person just didn't like it. It was really weird. But on the surface, they gave the appearance that they did. But anytime I would engage in my job as a musician, as a sound engineer, it would trigger things for them in really weird ways. Like, it was like, that's getting in the way of us, and why are you doing that? And it was like, but I'm doing my job. This is how I earn a living. I run a company that produces sound, that produces music. I have to do this thing, you know, and it would always cause problems. Anytime I would go out to earn a living doing this thing that I loved, there would always be some sort of something, some weird atmosphere, weird arguments around me just doing the thing that I love. And it really messed up my relationship with music long after that.
Yeah, I can imagine. But also I think the key in what you're saying that I hear is anytime I was doing this thing that I love, it sounds like, you know, potentially that person was threatened by the fact that you loved something else.
Yeah.
Or that it would take your time. And I think one of the things, just based on my own experiences and so much that I've read, is that people who are inclined towards manipulation and abuse tend to be very, very attuned to a person's vulnerabilities and the things that give them confidence, affirmation, a sense of self. And they almost instinctively go for those things first when they are trying to sort of undermine someone's self-worth and maintain control over them.
Are they doing it consciously or subconsciously?
I mean, that is a question that I spent a lot of time, and I think there are multiple theories, and it depends whether I'm no psychologist, but I think it very much depends on who the perpetrator is. Are they going for it because they don't want to be abandoned? And each time you go out to do this thing you love, you know, it's a threat. They feel that they're going to be abandoned, in which case it might fit, I imagine, what a psychologist would say is more of a borderline profile. Are they more of a psychopath? In which case, you know, probably it's very conscious. I don't know enough. That's not my field, but I imagine it would really depend who the perpetrator is and what their psychology is. But it's a common tactic.
It was so confusing because for me, I love when people are doing the thing that they love. It's one of the things that kind of it excites me, you know, it makes me happy. Like when I see you engaged in your work as a researcher, as a facilitator, you know, even when I see you getting stuck into the social media for our stuff and you're telling me stuff like, yeah, and I've done this and I've got this and I really understand it and the data says this and we've got listeners from here and they're doing this and they're doing that and it's just great and I'm in the data. I'm like, woo, I love it. I'm glad you're doing it.
I have no desire.
I have no desire. Do you know what I mean? But I'm really, I love it when people are good at things. Like I have friends who are just beasts at what they do.
Yep.
You know, whether it's Marcos who helped us, you know, work out the shots for this show.
Yeah.
And when he gets into his nerd thing, he's got his big trolley with all his gear on, and he starts pulling stuff out. And he's like, this has to go there. He gets his little notepad out. He's writing in it notes, and he's taking pictures going, you have to follow those instructions for the camera.
Yeah.
And I'm just like,
here's a light map. I remember when he came. Yeah, I love it. I also love when people just are just nerds for what they do. It's like why I love you being such a tech nerd and so into music and waking up at 3 a.m. with some next idea for a script you're going to write, because it's like you're being the fullness of yourself.
Right.
But and I think this raises an important thing, because so often when you come out of an awful experience like that, you come out crushed in a shell of yourself.
Yeah.
And the hard thing to remember is they attacked all the things that made you powerful.
Oh. Wow.
It's true, though. They wouldn't go for things. Of course, somebody who wants to control things will go for the things. If they want to control you, they're going to go for the things that make you have self-worth, that you're clearly great at, to try and chip away.
Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me hearing your story is what you said, that people tend to imagine domestic violence and intimate partner violence. It's a man perpetrating against a woman, and the stats are very clear that is what's happening in the majority of cases. Mm-hmm. But your story is it seems so difficult to me because it's the opposite way round, right? So you have the femme person perpetrating against the masc presenting person, and I think that in the research around domestic violence within queer relationships seems to be a really common thing, because it plays out in ways that are not part of the script. Queer people are so often missed. The dynamic of abuse is so often missed by professionals. And when they do report, which is quite rare, services don't know how to handle it because it doesn't fit the model they're trained for in terms of violence. It makes me really curious about how you handled that situation when you found yourself there. Did you ever tell anyone? Did you report to anyone what was going on?
No. And I think part of it is exactly what you've said, is my model for domestic violence, which is an awful sentence because nobody should have a model for domestic violence, was male against woman and physical battering. I had no model for what I was going through. I didn't even know that I was going through domestic violence. I just knew that my mental health was declining as a result of this relationship. I felt trapped. I felt alone. And I was constantly walking on eggshells. I was scared to express myself, as in to say the things that I needed to say. During that relationship, I went into therapy, which I definitely needed to go into therapy because I had my own hang-ups, in the relationship as a result of just me and the way that I'd been raised and the way I'd been taught things. Because I think one of the things that I had been taught growing up, which I've spoken about in previous episodes, is this idea that you don't air your dirty laundry.
Yeah. Yes.
You don't speak what's going on in your home out in the world. So that's another silencing technique as well, because you haven't taught me how to express myself and emotional intelligence growing up in terms of my upbringing. But B, you've told me not to air my dirty laundry.
Yeah.
That's the perfect situation for a complete silencing.
Yeah.
Right?
Cocktail of shit.
A cocktail of shit.
Yeah.
And I went to therapy during that relationship, and I had a brilliant, brilliant therapist. And she really helped me sort through a lot of stuff in my life beyond the relationship. But one of them was finding your voice and setting boundaries. And I would start to try in that relationship to say when things weren't right. And then, of course, that person would then, the narrative switches again. So now it's prior to therapy, you don't speak up. We don't have good communication. And it was true. I wasn't good at communicating. I definitely wasn't. I was the kind of person who would withdraw rather than speak up. So that definitely is my flaw that I had in that relationship. And so I got into therapy and she worked on that with me. So then I started to communicate.
Right.
I'm experiencing this. I don't like the way this feels. When this happens, it makes me feel like this. And now it was you're not using the right tone of voice when you communicate. It's not the right time for you to communicate those things. Okay. So there was always a reason why what I was doing or saying wasn't right because it didn't make her comfortable.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Completely.
And so then, of course, now you're trapped between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
If I say it's wrong, if I don't say it's wrong, if I withdraw, it's wrong, everything is wrong. So therefore, nothing I do is right.
Yeah. Well, you can't win.
You
and
can't
that
win.
is so often what it is to be in a relationship with an abuser. And then the other thing that gets confusing when you get into therapy and you start to build an awareness of your own patterns is you're constantly in this dance in your head of, am I the problem? Are they the problem? Are we both the problem?
Exactly. Which I did that dance.
Yeah. Oh, I did that dance for myself in a situation for a while because it's like, so, you know, some of the things that you're describing, I'm remembering other relationships, which I wouldn't necessarily characterize as abusive. Mm-hmm. And it was like, okay, well, you've got an avoidant and you've got an anxious and then nobody wins and everyone's in this dance. But it's a complete difference when there's that dance going on alongside some extreme swinging of love bombing to I'm smashing up your shit.
Exactly.
You know? And it's a very hard line when you're first figuring that out because you get stuck.
Yes.
And the tendency you have when you're in an abusive relationship is to self-blame.
Yeah, you love the person.
Yeah, well,
You love the person. So and when you love somebody or you love something, you try to find the best in that person.
Yeah. And you try to make it work endlessly and
you make
to your own
excuses.
detriment.
Yeah, you make excuses for the person. So it's a really tricky one. It's not straightforward when it comes to, you know, these more subtle bits of domestic violence, you know. It's almost like it's a spectrum.
Well, yes, and I think that's a really important point which we should talk about.
But they're all bad though. Even though it's a spectrum, it's still bad.
It's a spectrum, but really, very rarely. You've described a relationship where you say from the beginning there were signs and it was always manipulative.
Yeah.
But actually, very often in these scenarios, someone slowly turns up the temperature. And so you have to understand the spectrum to understand,
that's true.
Oh, this early behavior here can, you know, just completely lose control and escalate and turn into something very different.
Yes.
And finding that line. I mean, all of it's bad, but you also need to know the early signs that are more subtle. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like...
No, it's true.
It's difficult.
It really is true.
There's another thing beyond not airing your dirty laundry and understanding what abuse looks like. Where does your queerness fit into this? Was that silencing in any way?
Absolutely. As I've spoken about in episode 1 of our show, I talked about being queer, coming from a Christian background, a very stringent form of Christianity, and then coming out as gay, right? Your community doesn't recognize your sexuality. They don't accept your sexuality. Your sexuality is an abomination, and that's it. It's a sin. So if you're in a relationship with someone of the same sex, you are living in sin.
Yeah.
How do you then turn around to the people that you love who are a part of that religion and believe those things and say to them, I'm also in an abusive relationship? Because what happens is, well, that's really, really easy then, Aiwan. You need to repent of your sins, get out of that relationship, and then your life will be better.
Yeah. It's almost like it's your fault for living in sin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that many Christian men abuse their wives.
Yeah.
And that it happens in heterosexual relationships as much as it happens in queer relationships. But that's, of course, different in quotes, you know? So, yeah, of course you're not going to speak up because already you're seen as an abomination and your relationship is an abomination. I think the other thing as well is if you are estranged from your family because of your sexuality, you are alone in terms of support network as well. Where normally you'd have a conversation maybe with your family members, some family member, and talk on that deep, intimate level. When you're estranged, you don't have that. So it's like another layer of being isolated.
Completely. And again, I think that there's two things going on there. One, we know from the literature that abusers tend to isolate their victims, but Two, again, something my therapist once told me is that they know how to identify people who are vulnerable, who are already isolated, who are already removed from support networks, because that's an easy target.
Yes.
You know, it's not good. And that must be pretty common, again, within LGBT communities.
Of course, particularly when I think about Black communities and other communities that tend to be culturally homophobic and then religiously homophobic. It's like two levels of homophobia. It becomes even more difficult.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the fact as well that can women abuse each other? We're used to the narrative of a man abusing a woman, but a woman abusing a woman. And then it's like, but she's a woman, so just do it back. It's a bit like, you know, when we say to little boys, you know, you never hit a girl.
Yeah.
But if a boy hits you, knock him the fuck out.
Yeah.
But also with a girl, it's a girl, you know, I don't know, do some bitchy shit back or knock her out or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You're two women. So therefore go and give as much as you get.
Yep.
So these things are all playing out in your head as you're going through what you're going through. Yeah. And it all just feels a bit embarrassing and a bit shameful and difficult to get out of.
Yeah. And also, you know, there is so little research in this area, but of the little research that does exist, exactly what you describe shows up. So Gallup in 2019 put out a resource and a guide about what intimate partner violence looks like with LGBT communities. And it's really fascinating because it basically says everything that you've said. This thing plays out on a different script. Women can commit violence as much as men can. It doesn't mean, like, there's a tendency to see these things as equal when it happens between people of the same sex. Like, there's no victim and no perpetrator. It's just people in an argument, essentially. Let alone when the power dynamics are that you would expect the femme one to be the one that's being knocked out, not the one that's the aggressor, right? That's the script people have.
Yeah.
So I feel like stories like yours, while they're rarely spoken, are probably far more common than you might expect.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see a slight shift, even in the entertainment space, around domestic violence. So, for example, Baby Reindeer, we saw that where the abuser, the stalker, was a woman. There was a documentary series on Netflix, My Wife, My Abuser.
Yes.
Which was really harrowing, seeing what he went through with that woman.
Yeah.
You know, so we are starting to see people understand that the domestic violence situation is not just man as aggressor against woman. A woman can be an aggressor too. Yeah. And women can aggress against women, and a man can aggress against a man in a same-sex relationship. That is starting to shift, if slowly, but it is starting to shift.
Yeah. And I think the statistics, if I'm not mistaken, are actually that heterosexual women and bi women, and I think maybe even lesbian women, experience very similar levels of violence. But gay men in relationships with gay men, there's far more intimate partner violence there than with heterosexual men. If I'm not mistaken, we'll check that out and then include it in the show notes. But it's where there are human beings, there is violence. And that's not to say primary aggressors aren't like men against women. It's definitely the case that it disproportionately is at least reported that way. And we see it that way for obvious reasons. Talking of the entertainment industry, did we not watch a series of the Queer Ultimatum on Netflix recently where they did a reunion and there was a queer couple? Do you remember that?
Oh, Queer Ultimatum.
Yes. There was one couple that came back, and I do not think that they handled that
at all well. Oh my God, that was levels of chaos that I don't think I've ever seen in a reunion.
It was so chaotic, but also so like ethically questionable. I feel like there was this way in which they just completely ignored and didn't engage with this domestic violence scenario between, was it Mildred, this Latina woman?
Yes.
Who was in a relationship with a woman called, I want to say her name was Tiff or something?
Yeah, Tiff and Mildred. It was
Tiff
Tiff
and
and
Mildred?
Mildred, yes.
Yeah, it was Tiff. And basically they came back to the reunion. They'd had this awful up, down, on, off, cyclical, classically abusive, toxic relationship dynamic. They decided they were going to keep their relationship to work, make it work after the thing. And then when they came to the reunion, they disclosed that Mildred had been arrested for throwing picture frames and a baby gate at Tiff.
That was it.
Do you remember?
Yes.
And then it was just like, they acted like people just moved on with the conversation. Like that wasn't a massive revelation, and that she didn't just get a DV conviction or arrest.
Chaos.
I feel like it was not treated with the seriousness either because they didn't perceive it to be abusive, or because they didn't want to be accused of being essentially homophobic, right? Or queerphobic in some way.
And this is the problem, is that because of the advances in terms of LGBTQ plus people being able to be a part of society,
be more represented,
laws being changed, we're almost in this phase where it's like, well, you only say good things about LGBTQ plus people. We only show good things about LGBTQ plus people. And we definitely don't show the dark stuff because we don't want to set ourselves back. We don't want to slur our image, for want of a better term.
Yeah.
I don't know what the correct term is, but
no, completely. And this is a common thing for many minoritized communities. Like you're Muslim, you're Black, you don't want to talk about things that really do go on in our community. Like, because we know a system wants to put laws like stop and search laws and disproportionately target our communities.
Yes.
But we also know that there is crime that goes on in our communities.
Absolutely.
And that it affects us more than anyone else.
Yes.
So now we don't want to name it. It's the same with, like people from Muslim backgrounds not wanting to talk about the same issues, whether it's intimate partner violence or anything else, because they already know the environment is so hostile that if you give people even an inch, the system is going to take a mile, and you're going to
The system will take 10 miles.
Yeah, and Joe Public is going to use that as a stereotype, and that leaves the most vulnerable within marginalized communities even more vulnerable, right?
Yes, exactly.
And it's very problematic. I think that should have been a learning moment on that Netflix thing. And on the flip side, by the way, as another entertainment example that's handled it really well, I'm massively into this podcast called Betrayal on iHeart.
Oh, yes. I always hear it. You're like in the shower, I could just hear like, and then he was outside my window at 2 a.m. And I'm like, what is going on in there?
Okay, look, I know I listen to a bit too much true crime. We're going to come back to this on another episode and why that is. But yes, there is stuff, like most of the stories that come up on this Betrayal podcast are stories of like just the worst betrayals in intimate relationships or family relationships, and then people uncovering it and the aftermath that you have to work through. But there's this one double episode, two-parter thing that they did, episode 25 and 26 of Betrayal, which tells the story of Morgan, the abuser, and Kelsey, the victim. And what I loved about how they did that show and how thoughtful they are is that they talk about the fact that they mostly get women who've been abused by men, but this happens everywhere. And this was two women in a relationship. Morgan was such a piece of work. Honestly, pathological lying. I don't want to give any spoilers because I really feel like just listen to the episode. But it's just does an absolute number on Kelsey when they meet at summer camp and form this intense lesbian bond and then start this relationship. And this woman basically steals most of her 20s on what turns out to be an absolute bed of lies. It gets so extreme that she claims to have cancer. And I won't say any more than that, but listen, they actually treat it with the, normalcy and sensitivity and also recognition that it is real violence that it deserves.
Yes. It's a brilliant episode.
Yeah.
A really good episode. So what has your experience been of domestic violence in queer relationships?
I mean, you're the most significant queer relationship I've been in. I definitely dated, but I wouldn't say got into any relationships before you that were same sex or queer in other ways. So Everything that I learned about domestic violence, I learned in heterosexual relationships. And I guess different from you, my parents had quite a peaceful, I had no real exposure to it as a young person to basically normalize it or experience. I didn't have to experience it until much later in life. And I would say what I did encounter was probably similar to you, hard to recognize because it didn't look like physical violence. It was much more emotional, psychological.
So it's interesting because on the one hand, what you experienced fits the narrative, i.e. it's between a man and a woman. But on the other hand, it doesn't fit in terms of the narrative is that it's normally a physical assault of some sort. That's what we think of when we think domestic violence. Did you know that it was domestic violence, what you went through in that relationship?
Well, okay, it's interesting because I think as you get older and as you encounter relationship, if you have something that's toxic, you sometimes don't realize it's toxic until later, some way into it. So I can think of 2 relationships I've been in, one that was borderline and one that was just very obviously on every level not right. And I think it's the one that was very obviously on every level not right that taught me so much about this area and made me have to go and read everything I could find. So that situation is, it was not obvious in the sense that there was no hitting, but there were all these other things which I now understand to be about coercive control. So it was with a man. They happened to be in a position of power, even though they were roughly the same age. Professionally, they were in a position of power. And so much of how the relationship developed, I now understand has the hallmarks of how these relationships tend to develop. So you talk about terms like love bombing. These have become really like common in popular psychology and Instagram. But when you've been love bombed and you have to process that experience, it is really unlike anything. It's been from moment one, showered with praise, told you're everything that person ever wanted, told things like, I saw you in a dream.
That old chestnut.
Like, I saw you in a dream. And you listen to it back. Like, even as I say it now, I'm like, that is the most ridiculous thing ever. Like, why would I ever believe that? Or how would someone ever believe that? But the point is that person did those things at a moment when I was extremely vulnerable and really not okay. My life was kind of in turmoil. It was just a very, very difficult period in my life. And they kind of swooped in. And it was all these, they play on this kind of almost fairy tale romance that you absorb in Hollywood and romance novels. And not only were they saying this, I saw you in my dream, and within like a week or two proposing to me.
A week or two?
Genuinely, I don't even think it was 2 weeks. And the thing about it, when they did it, they proposed in a jokey way, but I laughed and they were like, no, I'm serious. But I laughed because it was so preposterous. And then you think, how do you go from laughing to... I never went along with that because, first of all, this person wasn't even available to be married anyway, which was also part of the problem. I was embroiled in this kind of very...
So they were trying to do bigamy.
Secretive... Genuinely, like, what are you doing? And although there was also a level of lying going on because apparently they were separated, which I found later not to be the case. It was just so messy. I was completely pulled in, but also at some level, as I figured out in therapy, I clearly wanted to be rescued. I clearly had some part in that being pulled in. I had to do a lot of figuring out to figure out how this thing even worked on me, honestly. And it just descended into this awful experience because while it started off with all this almost fantasy relationship and very quick bonding, it became pathological lies, claiming to be separated, not actually being separated, claiming to have cancer at the moment where I had drawn a boundary. Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know people do this. This is like, remember that I was telling you that story about that betrayal podcast?
Yes.
One of the reasons I listen to things like that is it makes me realize, oh my God, I'm not the only one that has been through something like this. And that story was an example of someone who had someone lie about cancer, essentially to stop them leaving. And I'll tell you now, there was a load of things that happened that I'm not even going to get into.
But cancer though, I mean,
a whole tumor, I'm dying. And of course you're trying to leave because
how
you
do you
recognize
even pull off a lie like that?
I don't know, but what I know is this person got on a phone to me telling me that they had cancer and then literally mimicking coming out of anesthetic. And I look back at it now. No. I'm sorry. I look back at it now and I'm like, how did I fall for it? But
no, but
I was in such a load of turmoil at the time that I was just like, I remember the point where I first went to my therapist and I was like, I can't get out of this thing because they're sick and they're dying and they've got cancer. And I remember her looking at me going, he is lying to you. He's lying to you. And I remember just being like, who would lie about that?
And also the fact is that if you are a normal human being, you have empathy. So if someone says to you, I am dying of cancer, your instinctive response is, oh my God, how can I support? I want to be there for you. You absolutely can't be alone. It triggers empathy.
Yeah.
For regular people.
And that's what it did. And then I would feel that, they were doing these really maybe not even so subtle manipulation things, but something in my spirit was just ringing alarm bells because they would be saying that they are, really sick and they can't tell their employer and they can't tell anybody around them. And this is why they can't move forward in this relationship. And then I'd be like, well, you need to tell your employer you can't keep working if you're dying, essentially. And they'd be like, well, I can't stop working. It's not like someone's going to hand me 10K, or are they? And it would be like this person knew I was in the middle of negotiating a divorce, essentially.
Okay.
And so there was a thing about money. So I feel like something in my spirit I was having this dual experience at the same time of this person is saying one thing and there's a rage underneath me because I think there was some subconscious part of me that knew I'm being manipulated.
Yes.
And so as I started to challenge it, what I now understand to be gaslighting. So as soon as I would be like, the thing you're saying is not making sense. It's not, they would sort of deflect. They would make me how dare you question me after everything? And another thing they did was dangle loads of opportunities in front of me all the time because they had not just the gifts, they had professional power.
But those are types of gifts though, aren't they?
That's true. Yeah. That's true. I can get you into these places. And the weird thing was, even at the time I was like, I have no interest in those because I thought I was pursuing something I thought I wasn't there to get the gifts. The thing that I desperately wanted and needed at that time was love and acceptance and connection. And I was looking for it in the entirely wrong place because I had come out of this relationship where I had felt such a lack of those things as well. So I went from the frying pan into the fire.
Yeah. But even that is a type of abuse. The fact that you were in a relationship prior where you'd been emotionally neglected and things withheld from you that should really be given in the context of a relationship like the one that you were in.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's a really good point because there are also these much more subtle things about abuse. So there's the much more overt manipulation. But I also remember when I was dealing with that first relationship in therapy, one, you have those moments in a relationship with a therapist where they really say something and the attack is strong.
Oh,
and you're
yes.
like, whoa.
You're like, hold on now, therapist.
It was awful. She goes to me, you're in an abusive relationship. And I remember just being like, fuck you. I'm not in an abusive relationship. And then a couple of weeks later, I remember being in a session with her. And I said to her, a couple of weeks ago, you told me I was in an abusive relationship. Like, why do you think my relationship was abusive? Because I was just like, I do not see it that way at all. And she said to me, any relationship in which your needs are not being met systematically is an abusive relationship.
Wow.
And I was
That's
like,
a word.
It was, but I was
That's
also,
a word.
at first I was just kind of like, people don't get their needs met all the time. That's life. That's being an adult. And then she was just like pointing out, no, but you have this pervasive experience of leaving home young as a child and not having anyone around, and therefore not learning that you can expect to get your needs met. And you have gone and recreated a relationship in which many of the things that people perceive to be the basics in relationship aren't there. In other words, your relationship is characterized by neglect.
So your baseline is neglect.
Yeah. And she's like, and neglect is abuse. And if you think about it from a child point of view, it is. Of course it is.
I mean, I'm a teacher. One of the things that we always got taught was around safeguarding and how to spot the signs of abuse. And one of the signs is neglect.
Yeah.
If a child is being sent to school, for example, without food, or they're sent to school in clothes that are not appropriate for the weather, and so on, you learn to spot all of these signs. And neglect is definitely a type of abuse.
Yeah.
It's just that we forget that when we become adults.
Yeah.
Because we're used to taking care of ourselves, right?
Yeah, that part. But also we see abuse, as we're going back to what we were talking about earlier, as something that's very much actively happening.
Yes, it's visceral.
It's bodily.
Yes.
It's emotional and psychological manipulation.
Yes.
It's this. It's not someone not doing something. It's someone doing something. And so it's too easy to miss.
What were the impacts of that kind of behavior on you at the time?
The thing about being in those scenarios, particularly the one that was very actively manipulative, is you very, very quickly feel like you're going crazy. You feel like you lack sanity. You don't know what you can believe. You don't know what to trust. The idea that someone would lie about something, you feel desperate as well, because that's the point. They're manipulating you into this position of you're desperate to help them because they're playing on your empathy, but you can't win because they keep finding new things to make you more and more desperate. And at some point, I guess your body picks up that something's not right. So you have this very dual experience of being like, a part of you is waking up to the lies and a part of you is still very much stuck there and also still attached to this person who's actually really quite bad for you. So I have to say it was a very destabilizing time in my life. And I ended up, as I kind of extricated myself from that, with what I can only describe, and I mean this in the serious clinical sense of the word, as PTSD. I was having panic attacks. I didn't want to leave my house. I felt just deeply unsafe. And so for me, the way I dealt with that was to stay in. The pandemic hit shortly after, which kind of helped because it allowed me a space to stay in. But it also meant that I read so much about these kinds of relationships and came to realize that this thing I was in, this is a pattern. People do this. And there are words for it, like DARVO being the term that people, that describes what perpetrators do when you try and hold them to account.
Is it an acronym?
Yeah, so DARVO is an acronym, and it basically describes how people who perpetrate violence react when you try to hold them to account. Like the D is for deny. So they tend to deny any wrongdoing, that they ever committed any harm. They attack you and claim that you are the problem. They do the reverse victim thing. So they act like they are in fact the victim. And in my case, that had a very racialized and class dynamic. So this person who was abusing me was saying, you're light-skinned and you're lighter skinned than me and you're middle class and you actually have more power than me in this relationship and you're kind of misusing this power. And it was this constant, like, subtle identity-based manipulation that they would really attack. And really that was a good thing to attack in me, because I was in this heightened state of, no, as in, if you want to abuse someone, not in real life. If you wanted to go for something, like, you know how you said that's your person went for your vulnerability for music.
Yes.
With me, this person could sense me wrestling with race dynamics. I was deep in wrestling with, where am I as a mixed race person? You know, how should I be behaving if I have a light skin privilege?
I thought for some reason when you said that, I thought you were saying it was a good thing to attack you because somehow it was helpful to you as a light skinned person, not that it was good for him, as in that was the perfect thing to attack.
It was the perfect thing to go for, because there was a place where I might feel guilt or I might feel bad. It was easy to play on. And that's what I mean by these people. They find the thing that is your vulnerability or your source of power or whatever it is. Both of those two things I think they do. And they go for it. So if you wanted to make me, because there's another thing that people do who abuse, is another term was fog, right? You induce fear, obligation, and guilt. If you now make me feel guilty for, you know, something you've done for me or some aspect of my identity that I can't control that you claim holds power, I'm easy to control.
That's true.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's true. So
that was them sort of, again, this was stuff I learned at that point. Like, you go for those things.
So what's the V in DARVO?
Yeah, it was just coming to that. So no, the reverse victim, RV, is they reverse victim. So they claim that they are in fact the victim. So in this case, they claimed that somehow I had more power than them.
Because this person's working class and darker skin, therefore they don't have as much power as you as a light-skinned, middle-class person.
Mixed race person.
Okay.
So then we got into this, all sorts of, anytime I would claim something.
That's twisted.
No, that's not, it was very twisted.
That's twisted.
Very twisted. And then the final thing is so the offender, and that they claim that the victim is the offender.
Isn't that the same as reverse victim?
Yeah, pretty much. It's just an extension of that.
Oh, an extension, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there's all these acronyms.
Yeah, I get it, because actually, I get it. Because the reverse victim is saying, because of your thing, you're actually in a more elevated position. And then as a result of that, you are the offender towards me. You're doing bad things to me.
Yeah.
So I get it.
And the effect of that, you can imagine psychologically, is that you trust nothing. And if you're a conscientious and empathetic person, your automatic default is to go, oh my God, I feel awful. Have I harmed you?
Yeah.
Did I do something wrong? Am I the problem?
Look within. I did that many times.
Right.
Like, is it something I'm doing? I need to fix. That's why I went to therapy. I was like, I need to be better with my emotional intelligence. I need to not withdraw as much. I need to do this. I need to do that. As opposed to what you're doing to me is actually deeply abusive.
Yeah.
And you need to stop, or I need to leave. You internalize so much.
That is it. And I sat there thinking, who am I? What am I doing wrong?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you're in this very secretive relationship and it really keeps you stuck. You then don't,
that's the cage.
Because you think you're a bad person and you're shameful, you then don't go and speak to people and you don't ask for help.
Yeah.
And again, these are very unpopular things to name. I mean, I think this is the first time I'm naming out loud the race dynamic and the class dynamic they used. Because what if people judge you, or what if you're accused of being, I don't know, doing some kind of victim blaming, because in the social structure, you do in some respects have more power.
Yes.
So then you become the one that's claiming victims. It's a perfect thing to get someone in a tangle about.
That
really.
is a kaleidoscope of shit.
That
is mad.
Horrific.
Yeah.
But also I know it's nonsense, because if that person had been so as conscientious, I look back now and know, they would have gone, okay, well, I'm actually in a position of power and all of those. They would have been in the same kind of conscientious wrangling about their own position, and it would have been possible to have a conversation. But instead, they were only interested in telling me how I was a problem.
Right.
In a normal relationship, like if you and I were ever to have a tussle over something, it gets sorted out. But if need be, we'll go away, reflect on our own thing. We come back and we talk about it. And each of us have done that reflection.
Yes.
And each of us figure out what we're going to do.
As
and we
it should
resolve
be.
it.
Yeah.
And it's a simple matter and it's done, right? It doesn't even happen that often, like quite rarely. But in a toxic relationship, Nothing ever gets resolved.
No.
You go round the houses, round the houses, round the houses, round the houses.
And you can never come out of it. You're just stuck. And it's really maddening. There's something
crazy making.
It's crazy making.
Yeah.
Because you're just stuck in this spiral.
Yeah.
And you literally can't get out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Horrific. One thing in making sense of all that was that it really helped me to make sense of red flags in relationships, so that when I then came out of my isolating myself and started to, I guess, feel more confident going out and start feeling more safe, which took a long time, I had this very clear sense of what to look for if I ever went back to dating and what not to, right?
Yes.
And I knew there are certain red flags.
Same.
People fast track relationships. They try and move them really quick. They love bomb. So for me, I was going out thinking, if I see any of that, I don't want to be anywhere near it.
Yep.
And it's really interesting because you started by asking me, have I encountered DV in queer relationships? And I was like, no, but that's because by the time I started dating women,
You were ready.
I was armored
You
up.
had
Any
your
sniff.
shield of salvation, darling.
I came with a shambok, and I came with a sword, and I came with an axe, and I came with everything. I was like, you're not going to try me.
So one of the things that's come up quite a lot over the course of our discussion is the fact that there's not enough data about same-sex relationships as it pertains to domestic violence, but also other things as well. Research is starting to happen. And so I wondered what's actually happening in the field of research.
Yeah, it's interesting. This isn't a field I've spent a ton of time in, but I did recently come across this brilliant looking setup and cohort of people organised by a guy called Dr. James Rowlands at the University of Durham. And he's been bringing together this collective of researchers focusing specifically on this issue. And I know they gathered last year together to talk about it, and quite a few people were there. Super interesting insights. So I know they had presentations from somebody called Anna Werren, who talked about coercive control and what it actually is, that it's, sort of an act or pattern of acts of domestic abuse that are really about harming or punishing or frightening an individual, really creating a pervasive sense of fear, making them feel scared. So this thing you were saying about it not just being physical, but being psychological. And of course, this is kind of prevalent in all kinds of relationships. And there's like these really common tactics that abusers use, isolating, humiliating, exploiting, intimidating, belittling being a really common one.
That happened a lot. Oh my God, the body shaming.
Oh, yeah. We need to do a whole
thing
on body shaming in relationships, because it's wild. But, these things are really, really common. But what this person was arguing, Anna was arguing, was that there are very much identity-based tactics. So a little bit like the race and class thing was used against me, many perpetrators will use that. So they'll do things like withhold gender-affirming care. They'll isolate them from LGBT social networks when they may already, like you, be isolated from their family. They will out people intentionally in spaces that would cause them harm. Right, you can imagine the impact of that on people in our community, where it's not safe to be out. You might focus on, if you have a trans partner, dead naming them intentionally and pretending it's like not intentional, just to, I guess, trigger them, frustrate them. That's their vulnerability. Like I said, they go for the vulnerability, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Misgendering them, same sort of thing. So, there's stuff that's starting to look at the very unique ways this plays out in these kinds of dynamics that, you wouldn't necessarily recognize if you were trained to respond or support survivors of domestic violence.
And I think it's important for LGBTQ plus people to also know this as they go into relationships, because again, like with my relationship, because it didn't match what I'd seen growing up and what I'd seen on the screen, I didn't recognize that what I was experiencing was domestic violence.
Yeah.
And I think for same-sex for people in same-sex relationships, it's important to understand the unique ways that some of this behavior, the humiliation, the belittling actually plays out.
Yeah.
That's specific to you being in an LGBTQ plus relationship.
Yeah,
I think it's so important.
Absolutely critical. And again, it makes me think about what we're always talking about with telling our stories and seeing them on screen. I can't actually think of, yes, we've now seen Baby Reindeer.
Yes.
We've seen a few things come through with Queer Ultimatum, which, as I said, I don't think was handled that well.
At all.
I've talked about a podcast where I thought it was, but in mainstream TV, I can't think of too many examples of a deep, sensitive handling with that level of nuance for our community.
No, the only thing I've seen literally is the book we reference at the top of the episode, which is In the Dream House by Carmen Machado.
Yeah.
I haven't really seen it. And I think that's another reason why representation is important, because I imagine that there are LGBTQ plus people writing about this stuff, but who's commissioning it?
Yeah.
Because who are the commissioners?
Yeah.
And who are the people in power? Who are the execs?
Yeah.
So I feel like as we move into those positions of power, both in the traditional entertainment spaces, but even in terms of the more, like YouTube, for example, is becoming a big force. And that's obviously content created by
people like us,
right? So as we start to take our place in that world, I think we are going to start to see stories that represent us and the nuances of our relationships.
I sure hope so, because it's really needed.
That's it from us today. We really appreciate you being a part of the process.
And for questioning, co-creating, and staying curious with us.
Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It really helps others to find us.
Catch you next time on Rigor and Flow.
Thank you.
Thanks.